All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Excuse me just for a moment. Yeah, this is an educational channel, and thanks for tuning in. We check out obscure stuff that is important. Grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. And we've been looking into some earth-shattering discoveries about the New Testament of the Bible, Bible Decode number 198. And we've been checking out a lot about the fascinating Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. If you can put aside the idea that the New Testament was written by God or something like that, inspired in that way, the Word of God, that actually it's a very obvious psyop that was written by the Romans. The Romans wrote the New Testament, the Caesars, in particular the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, which is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that were in charge of the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And they backdated the story of Jesus because they were trying to use a psychological operation on their enemies, the Jews. The Vespasian and Titus were generals in the war that just ended between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD, before they became the emperors. And they were both actually wounded in the war. They were tired of the aggressiveness, the militancy of the Jews. They wanted to figure out a way to, quote, domesticate them, or tame them, or neutralize them, or prune them, or perhaps even graft onto their whole thing and absorb it. And so they wrote, taking advantage of the Jews who were constantly revolting, uprising, revoluting, insurrecting, and rioting. They were doing so because of their religion. They had all of these strictures and rituals and codes that they had to follow. Their God was zealous and jealous and separatist and monotheistic. They believed they were the chosen people. And so they literally were willing to risk their lives to maintain all of their rituals, which were a big pain in the butt for the Romans to govern. Of all of the people that lived in the Roman Empire, the Jews were by far the most difficult to deal with and the highest maintenance for them. And so they took advantage of the fact that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. But the Messiah they were waiting for was a political, military Messiah that was going to help them kick out the Romans, who had, been occupying Judea since 63 BC. So over 100 years, 130 years to the Jewish war between the Romans and the Jews. And so they took advantage of that. There were actually, to start the war, there were a number of candidates or self-proclaimed messiahs that did rise up, and they kicked out the Herod Agrippa II, the puppet king of the Romans. He was of the Herod family. They were clients of the Roman government. He made him flee back to Rome, and they Emperor Nero had to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. It took like 7 years because the Jews, they would not surrender. They were insistent upon dying if necessary, and they would not bow down to Titus especially. And they were willing to commit suicide rather than surrender, which is what they did at Masada to finally end the war in 73 AD. All of this is according to the story that we know was written by the Romans, which went under the name of Josephus, or Josephus, who was, according to his own autobiography, not only a court historian of the Romans, living in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, but actually a literal member of the family of the Flavians. He was known as Flavius Josephus, as he was adopted by Vespasian after after Josephus predicted that one day Vespasian would become emperor. At that time, Josephus was a Jewish military commander who had just surrendered to Vespasian. And he then defected, saying that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. So this is the guy, Josephus, who wrote the history in 7 volumes of the War of the Jews. And he made Vespasian and Titus the protagonists. And Vespasian and Titus, in turn, endorsed enthusiastically the book. But if you read War of the Jews together with the New Testament, you will discover that they are written by the same entity. There are too many parallels between the two for them to have been written by different people, because the parodies go both ways. Sometimes the New Testament is parodying War of the Jews, and sometimes War of the Jews is parodying the New Testament. And the parallels are all over the place. There are a series of different families of parallels. There's one parallel where every place that Titus goes in his military campaign, Jesus goes in his ministry. Jesus' ministry is just a mirror of Titus's military campaign in Judea. They go to the same places in the same order, and they undergo parallel events at each location. And we're talking about 40 or more separate events. Also, Michael Menescot's in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, he dug into the book of Luke and found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke between Luke and Josephus. Luke only has 1,151 verses. That's over 1 every 5 verses. There's a parallel. That's hard to even write in there that much, because many of the parallels occupy several verses. But anyway, also more circumstantial evidence. They had the motive. This is right down the alleyway of their MO. They had created a number of other religions in the first century, the Romans. And they also, not only did they have the opportunity, but they are the only people who had the opportunity. Because the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, and on distribution. Nobody else even had the capability of writing this and putting it out there and getting it seen. Not to mention the fact that it is written in Greek, which was very rare in Judea, but utterly commonplace in Rome. And also, Menescot's analysis, when he does find those 250 parallels, he graphs them on a chart. And after putting, Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, when plotting all 250 points, all the dots form 5 near-perfect letters in Latin. APTVS. Latin is the language of the Roman Caesars at this time. So the Romans are mocking you if you believe this. Not only did they write the New Testament, but they signed their name to it. And still 2,000 years later, nobody's figured it out yet. But actually, a lot of people have figured it out. But they kind of, way back when, had to kind of write it in code. It hasn't been figured out and put into explicit language until starting 150 years ago, but now about 10 or so books are out there that cover this topic from different angles. Because the parallels in the book of Luke and so on aren't all there. There's a whole family of parallels in Revelation, in the Pauline epistles, with the Romans as well. And all of the evidence that Christians use to corroborate the existence of Jesus, all of it is Roman. Like Josephus, it is the person that a Christian will tell you, corroborates the existence of Jesus by mentioning him in his book, Jewish Antiquities. Well, if he's in on the op, that evidence is worthless. But now we've moved into a little bit of a different area where we're looking at an author who doesn't really know about this Roman origins hypothesis, but they are scratching at the door, or they're knocking at the door. They're about to walk in the door. They understand the general thing that's going on, but they don't put their point to it. We're going to kind of evaluate this. Along with, this will help us with the decode once we get around to decoding the book of Luke again. And this book is called Operation Messiah by Thies Voskelen and Rosemary Sheldon. And they examined the hypothesis that they believe that Paul actually existed, not being fiction, like the Roman origins hypothesis would, at least for a lot of the people that buy into that, they recognize that Paul didn't exist, or he may have existed, but the story is fiction. It may be based on a true story or whatever. But anyway, their idea is that Paul was an intelligence agent for the Romans all the way from the start, even when he was persecuting Christians or persecuting Jesus and his followers, and then he has his conversion. That was the psychological operation, or that was the false flag event. Just think, how is he able to be in this Roman military, at least police type force, to be, persecuting Jesus and his followers, and then he has an experience and he completely flips, and his own people don't do anything to him. They just let him flip. So anyway, we had just started the introduction yesterday. And so we're going to read from where we left off here, where we're talking about Paul and who he was and so on. Now, this issue is important because Jesus is completely deferential to the Romans. Turn the other cheek to oppression, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, be a prince of peace, while attacking the Jewish traditions and many of the Jews that gave him a hard time. Paul is even more so. Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus is. So, almost as if they were written by the Romans themselves. So Paul remained a controversial figure in the generations that immediately followed his own. The pastoral epistles, so-called, which are 1st and 2nd Timothy and also Titus, are accepted by most scholars as having been written after Paul's lifetime. Because although they are written from within the tradition that Paul inaugurated, they seem to present a softer, somewhat idealized Paul, more amenable to the faith forms and structures of mainstream Christianity as it emerged from the 1st century. Even the Paul of the book of Acts seems to have been stripped of much of the controversy known to us from his letters. His more distinctive teachings have been stripped away, and Paul himself seems to have been shorn of most of his prickles. The most direct heirs of the Nazarene tradition within earliest Christianity regarded Paul as the greatest apostate, an arch-enemy, and so it becomes apparent that the Paul retained by Christianity was a domesticated Paul, a Paul rendered more comfortable, an ecclesiastical Paul. Especially in Acts. And I guess these pastoral epistles as well. Okay. Our particular reconstruction focuses on an aspect of Paul's life that has been sometimes hinted at but never treated at length. His possible connections to Roman intelligence. As with all intelligence history, one must read between the lines to draw inferences about what people did in undercover work. Clandestine operations are rarely discussed openly unless an operation is blown and the operatives are exposed. While the traditional view of Paul as theologian, apostle to the Gentiles, martyr and saint, has imprimatur of religious authorities, other interpretations are possible, and indeed should be encouraged. We must never flatly believe anything in the historical record. We must weigh every piece of evidence, no matter how poor or biased, and see what it tells us about this person we call Paul. The persuasiveness of any reconstruction will be determined by its overall coherence and explanatory power. The plausibility of our interpretation will be judged by the degree to which all the elements of the emerging behavior can be accounted for. We believe we can do this by stripping away the religious veneer that was added to Paul's story by later Christian writers, and by relying on rational explanations instead of resorting to supernatural ones, which are really non-explanations, since they are a disguised way of saying we do not understand. Exactly. So, either, we do not understand basically is either God or Satan. And Satan was also created by the Romans. In the same book, the New Testament, they took a term that is in the Old Testament a handful of times, but never as a supernatural being, always as a human being, meaning an obstacle or an adversary. And they blew this Satan character up into, some kind of a competitor with a omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent God, as opposed to in the Old Testament where, a lot of these, you have a more of a God with a small g who has a bunch of personality disorders and has a lot of competition with other gods, but a lot of Christians identify them as Satan, such as Baal and what's the other one's name? Ashtoreth and Baphomet, and I'm forgetting one, but you get the idea. Okay, 19th century New Testament studies, especially Pauline studies, saw Christianity as a purely spiritual religion, as opposed to the parochial and overtly political religion of Judaism. Roman imperial politics were little more than a backdrop. Both Jesus and Paul were portrayed as apolitical themselves, even if there were social or political implications to their ministries. Historians, as opposed to theologians, are finally discussing Paul in the greater context of the Roman Empire, its imperial aims and its ideology. Christianity is, above all, a product of empire. It is legitimate to ask, therefore, about the connection between that empire and the man who is often referred to as the second founder of Christianity. While we agree with this new emphasis, we part ways from scholars who believe Paul was opposed to the Roman Empire. They believe that what became the established religion of the Roman Empire started out as an anti-imperial movement. If it is true that Jesus catalyzed the movement for an independent and renewed Israel, a movement against Roman occupation, and one that eventually led to his crucifixion by the Romans on a charge of sedition, then our question must be, was Paul a part of that movement, or did his ideas constitute something quite different? The form of Pauline Christianity that survived, and its apologists insisted that Christians were paradigms of political loyalty to Caesar, unlike the Jewish revolutionaries who proclaimed no ruler but God. Later Pauline Christians found room for loyalty to the Roman emperor, despite their exclusive religious loyalty to the one God. We believe Paul was the forerunner of this compromise, and there is a good possibility that he was placed in this position by the Romans themselves to put forth such a message and provoke contemporary anti-Roman elements into revealing themselves. We see Paul as supporting the imperial structure, benefiting from it, cooperating with it, often saved by it, and perhaps even financially supported by it. The end product for Rome was exactly what it wanted: a loyal, otherworldly, spiritual movement that was completely divorced from Palestinian revolutionary movements, from Jewish nationalism, and from any challenge to Roman imperial authority. Its followers were supposed to pay taxes and be loyal citizens of the emperor. If we understand Paul's loyalty to his employer, we can understand his agenda. It all comes down to whether one believes Paul was catalyzing religious congregations of Gentiles to be loyal Romans, or creating anti-imperial alternative what is that word? I can't, it's kind of blurry. Alternative it's possibly societies. Okay, I think that's the only blurry word. Sorry about that. The easiest thing to do is depoliticize Paul for religious reasons. That word is societies. I can see it now. The O and the C look like an X. And so, okay. The easiest thing to do is depoliticize Paul for religious reasons, as if he lived in a political vacuum, which he did not. He lived in the Roman Empire. His teachings were spread throughout the Roman Empire, and he created followers who were loyal to the Roman Empire. Many of the conclusions we reach represent a substantive shift away from the traditional religious and scholarly understanding of Paul. This interpretation will come as anathema to those who still see Paul through the lens of Lutheran theology, as will those who still view Jesus as an innocuous religious teacher. Neither Acts nor Paul's letters can be taken at face value, and neither source paints a picture of Paul so complete that there are not huge gaps to be filled. Both the letters and Acts may even be the product of an age much later than is usually assumed. I certainly agree with that. What we intend to do is assess the sources, create a non-theological, historical intelligence narrative that makes sense, and leave the final judgment to the reader. We will examine the sources and write our history on the basis of what Paul did and how he justified what he did. We will separate that from what later commentators like Luke said about him. We are simply offering a new interpretive format, a way of looking at Paul through different eyes. The facts have not changed. We simply do not look at the history through a theological lens. Okay, so this next section is called Cover Story. When reading our sources, we have tried to uncover the most likely course of events in between the crucifixion and the end of Paul's life. Some of what we are told may have been a cover story. Our method of analysis has been to keep certain questions firmly in our minds. And I guess he's going to this thing that he has starred. I'm a little bit confused. It says, what in the text does not happen that in a natural situation would have been natural or likely to happen? Okay, so what? That's the question that we're trying to keep firmly in our minds. What in the text does not happen that in a normal situation would have been natural or likely to happen? It's a very good way to detect psychological operations, false flag operations, stuff like that. To use an obvious example, if members of a dissident movement are arrested or executed by the authorities, which members are not arrested or executed? Who, under close scrutiny by the government, becomes the next leader? That man may very well be the traitor and or operate under a pact with the authorities. The last name Epps strikes me, but I'm trying to remember what that's about. If that man used to work for the authorities as a member of the secret police, it does not require much imagination to think of the possibility that he went undercover to start a branch of a dissident movement monitored by the authorities. What type of information does the writer not give? This is another one of his questions to keep firmly in mind. What type of information does the writer not give, contrary to his information elsewhere? For example, if the writer of Acts describes the Roman response to the course of events in some places? Why does he not keep mentioning the Roman response elsewhere? If Paul is preaching the alleged message of the former enemy of the state, Jesus, why do the Romans not act against him? Next question. Which aspects of the story does Luke highlight, and which ones does he ignore, gloss over, or forget to mention? Is there a pattern to these irregularities? Since an historian cannot accept the explanations God or angels as historical actors or causes of some events in the book of Acts, what alternative explanations are possible for several turning points in the story? Comes to mind where Paul is being imprisoned, and then there's an earthquake that miraculously loosens everybody's shackles. So a historian has to look for explanations in the domain of events on the ground, presumably caused by human motives and actions. For example, when Acts tells us that an angel freed Paul from a Roman prison, we have to disregard this irrational non-explanation of a historical event and assume ordinary human beings released Paul, and that is, men whose identities could not be disclosed for whatever reason. Oh, so that's exactly what he was talking about. Okay, I think we're about all done. So we will start up here tomorrow when we resume. With these are the kind of questions that end a scholarly career or prevent one from starting. So we will check out that starting tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment as you see fit. Come back tomorrow and keep going over this with us. It's valuable information. Have a great day.